Slide 12, the role of regional science. And as I said, the firm being front and centre. Understanding what firms do, where they do it, and why have been key questions for regional scientists such as Walter Izard, who founded regional science back in the early 1950s. But all these questions have led to the question of how firms operate, how the people communicate with each other, what relationships they have, how information is shared, etc. It's the how that matters most nowadays. So this how question is a key focus for regional scientists. It's driving much of the new regionalism literature, and it is shaping regional development in Australia and across the world. Slide 13. The firm and regional development. With the firm anchored central to regional development and regional science, what we are really interested in here is how does the firm operate to create regional wealth? What are the processes that firms are involved in that result in income being spread throughout the community and contributing to regional development outcomes? It's really that question of how does this take place? How do we leverage firm activity to provide regional benefits? Slide 14, regional development's potted timeline. And here on, for the next few slides, we'll go through the history of regional development in Australia and how that's kind of manifested in real terms. So back in the 1960s to the 1970s, Keynesian policy, or big government intervention, aimed to correct market failures of the day. And so Keynesian policy involved things such as providing port infrastructure, providing cheap electricity through hydro-industrialisation, providing a myriad of services to private businesses involved in forestry, etc., through Forestry Tasmania. It involves these sorts of government interventions into the market, aiming to provide benefits that couldn't be attributed to a single business. So they're meant to provide broad benefits for our society. And that led to, in the 1970s, this idea that government should really intervene and stimulate economic development within a region. And that was the growth pole theory developed by Perot, a Frenchman, back in 1950, who suggested that a region or any particular economic activity that government put in a place would attract economic activity conducive to that economic activity and could repel counterproductive economic activity. This was exemplified in Australia by the Albury-Wodonga Development Corporation and its attempt to decentralise urbanisation in Australia. So just to give a bit of background on that, back in October 1973, Gough Whitlam and Sir Robert Askin, the New South Wales Premier, and the Premier of Victoria, Rupert Hamer, met in Wodonga and signed the Albury-Wodonga Area Development Agreement. This aimed to develop a economically sustainable city in Albury-Wodonga as an attractor to investment. And the Albury-Wodonga Development Corporation was charged with implementing that project, and part of that was to coordinate urban land use planning, to provide incentives to attract industry and employees, to provide social, educational, cultural, recreational services and facilities, to develop land for industry and residential uses, and to provide public infrastructure. A Google search of the Albury-Wodonga Development Corporation will probably provide you with more information about that attempt at growth pole development in Australia. There are other examples in Australia, but the Albury-Wodonga example was probably the largest attempt by government to stimulate regional development growth using growth pole theory. Slide 15, continuing on, the 1980s, we saw neoliberalism re-emerge and demand small government, reduced intervention by government, and the idea that neoliberalism attempts to push of let the market rule all started to re-emerge as governments were spending more and more on regional development. So, as a response, governments became reluctant to spend, but the citizens, Australians, wanted ongoing government provision of various services, in particular infrastructure development and social provision. So on slide 16, government-driven institutional intervention, we see that governments attempted to set up region-based development organisations or provide direct support to local governments for those sorts of regional development activities that government had traditionally delivered. This allowed, by government setting up these organisations, it allowed government to direct the funding to these organisations and really keep control over what went on in regions in Australia. So these planning authorities or development agencies began to provide water and agriculture policy, started to direct investments in highway and port development, urban and rural planning scheme development, etc. Slide 17, comparative advantage and the rise of smokestacks. So during this time we started to see regions trying to compete with each other based on comparative advantages. And we saw that regions started to think seriously about what incentives and subsidies could be applied to attract firms to their region. So we entered this age where comparative advantage was seen to be the principal ingredient for competitive advantage. Again, it's that hydro-industrialisation and cheap electricity. It's our climate, our soils, political stability, workforce, etc. This led to companies such as Camelco and Australian paper Zinifex all chasing that cheap electricity that Tasmania offered based on a stable workforce, etc. Slide 18, complacency in an uncertain world. So comparative advantage being the mainstay for quite some time of how we thought about attracting industries to regions, it started to come under a fair bit of challenges. Japan emerged as this post-war economic superstar. The Bretton Woods financial currency regime collapsed. The collapse of communism and the rise of the EU trading bloc. China and India emerging as economic powerhouses, especially now as we enter this Asian century. And the ongoing triumph of neoliberalism as an end in itself rather than as a means to an end. Let's not forget here that neoliberalism aimed to enable the market to provide for the needs of people whilst providing some kind of equitable wealth distribution. Those who wanted to try a little harder or push their business a little harder, whatever, would reap those rewards, and everybody under neoliberalism had those same opportunities. Unfortunately, in reality, it hasn't quite worked. So slide 19. Regional development, regional science and political and policy discourse globally readily adopted this mantra of globalisation as the new challenge and the new opportunity confronting regions. Everybody was jumping on the back of this idea that globalisation could distribute wealth more equitably, provide greater market efficiencies, and address some of those market failures. However, out of globalisation came this renewed focus, as we see on chapter 20, slide 20, on the region, on what is local. In this idea that post-globalism came about as regions began to differentiate themselves from their neighbours or competitor regions, whatever it may be. This is the essence of post-globalism. It brought a new focus on competitive advantage, especially around branding opportunities, such as those used by Tuscany in the Silicon Valley. For example, if we ask the question, what does if I say the word Tuscany, what does it mean? And from that, most people would probably answer great food, quality manufacturing, etc. Silicon Valley, same. It comes down to innovative software development and new technologies, etc. But let's not forget, Tuscany was a backwater in Italy, And Silicon Valley there just wasn't much going on there prior to Microsoft, etc., moving into that area. But what about Tasmania? What has the branding opportunities been for Tasmania? This is probably a time to pause the slideshow and write down a few ideas about what Tasmania means to the rest of the world when you say Tasmania. During class, some suggestions were that it may be, the forests, this idea of wilderness. I suggested, we missed a great branding opportunity with boat building in Tasmania. We have some outstanding boats being built, especially minesweeping cats built down in Hobart. We have great craftsmen building boats, etc., from Stanley all the way down to the Huon Valley. Is it the Apple Isle? Is it, fresh produce? Is it this green economy that is touted by politicians? But at the end of the day, post-globalism resulted in this idea of asking the question, or seeking answers to what markets are available for local enterprise. This has driven this idea of market-based regional development that we're interested in.